Good evening, all. This is James Sims from my PE exam and fellow teacher, and look, it's good to be here this evening. Thank you for joining me. I will be on screen a little bit later on, but as I haven't shaven nearly well enough over the last couple of days, I thought I'd keep that to a bit of a minimum, really. Look, really good audience we've got in tonight. Some really good people in here. Some really good colleagues. Just want to mention a couple of you. Not meaning to select anyone in particular, but Simon at Bullmarsh, really good to see you in here. Seems ages ago we went out for that meal. Simon, I can't believe how fast time's gone since then. We've got Karen here in Brussels, Karen Davies in Brussels. We've got Stuart Maddock over in Millfield, Lee Regan, I think Lee, if I remember right, at Cardinal Vaughan. And yeah, just a really good group of colleagues in this evening. Now look, as I said before, big thank you for being here. If you're anything like me, kind of the last week or the penultimate week leading up to Christmas holidays is a bit of a tough challenge. I'm shattered, so I'm sure there's many other people out there that are feeling very likewise. So a huge thank you for being part of what we're going to do this evening. This particular session has really been demanded by people who've attended other webinars that I've done over the course of the last few weeks. So it's one that I've been hoping to put on. What I am going to say about tonight's session, obviously we're going to look at the concept of mastery, as you already know. It's very much aiming tonight at getting you the big picture. Okay, so I really thought hard about whether to go into sort of heavy theory and looking at numerous sort of principles and researchers that have talked about this model a great deal. And I thought, you know what, in general, this time of the year, as what will be an introductory sort of session for many people in this particular area, I thought, let's go for the big picture. Let's go for the main sort of considerations when looking at a mastery model, and let's see if we can really get people grasping that, and then there'll be opportunities for developing that and researching that a little bit further later in the future. Now, obviously, we're going to look at this concept first of all, which is the current paradigm. Now, I suppose the current paradigm, we're talking loosely about our current educational model. Okay, I want to be clear here. There are going to be things that are a little bit critical, and those things are only ever meant to be critical of the educational model. The very fact that we have so many dedicated people in the room this evening in itself suggests how reflective you people are, how desperate you are to do a really good job. You know, there's absolutely no judgment made about individuals, but about a dominant educational model default that perhaps can do with some challenging and some shaking up, and that's really what we're looking to do. And from then, we're going to actually start to look at the mastery model and how we can go about maybe even implementing aspects of it before finishing later on. If you want to ask me a question, do feel free to post that into the chat section. The chat's available to you right now. Post that in there, and every time I come back into the webinar room, I will have a look at those and try and answer those questions as best I can. I'll try and do that reasonably regularly. All right, well, look, let's make a start. What is our current educational paradigm? What is it that we do on a general day-to-day basis, and what structures do those things fit into? Now, I repeat again, some of this is going to be somewhat critical of the current paradigm and the current educational model. So I would say that the first thing that I would say is like a big picture consideration with regards to the current paradigm that, you know, really dominates education is that, broadly speaking, broadly, it's a one pace fits all model. One pace fits all model. Now, of course, there is no doubt whatsoever that many people work incredibly hard to put into place magnificent differentiation. I've said it many times before, those teachers, you teachers, are the real top of the pops teachers for me, because despite of this overall one pace fits all model of education that we have, where roughly the same processes happen to students at roughly the same pace all together as a group, many teachers struggle to differentiate despite and in spite of that current educational paradigm. And that's something that I think people should be really praised and appreciated for. This next point, I think, is absolutely critical to where we're going to go this evening. And it is that many of us are involved in what we might call course delivery. And the point I want to say is that the course moves on regardless of mastery of knowledge, skills, and behavior. The courses move on regardless of mastery level. Okay, so that is to say that if we are delivering a GCSE, an A-level, any other type of qualification, what we often do, not always, but what we often do, is we deliver a course. We provide a course experience, topic 1 in week 1, topic 2 in week 2, gradually mapping out the course as it goes through an academic year or 2 years or whatever it happens to be. Now, of course, there are naturally some exceptions to that. Okay, so there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, courses progress in that rate. And what we're saying there is whether or not students have mastered, the course moves on, the group moves on, the student is moving on. And therefore, we might end up with holes in knowledge for individual learners. We can broadly label our educational paradigm as what we would call an industrial process. Now, that industrial process in its current format, and there'll be many people in the room who have studied a bit of history of education and have looked at the kind of the Renaissance Enlightenment thinking, sorry, I should say the Enlightenment thinking that brought about the industrial model, factory model of education in the 19th century in this country and others. But what you might not realize is that a lot of our quality assurance processes today are built on Japanese industrial model principles, Japanese quality assurance processes. Now, I got a bit of a taste of this when I was doing an element of my master's a few years ago, or a master's that I still haven't actually finished. But I started studying modules on 1960s and 1970s Japanese car making and computer component industry kind of design and process. And I didn't really understand for a period of time why it was I was studying that within education. And of course, ultimately what it comes down to in the modern educational paradigm is that our quality assurance process, that testing, tracking, intervening, spotting defects, for want of a better term, comes very much out of this continuous industrial reflection of trying to make the product more and more and more and more refined by finding its defects. And I want you to think philosophically, ethically about how that might apply to the experiences of being a child, how it might apply to the experiences of being a child learner. And one of the things that I would say is that it has an impact on how young people experience errors. How young people experience errors. And in this model, errors frequently, not always, there are always many, many exceptions. I'm sure you achieve this all the time. Errors can be frequently deemed a defect. And if I spell it right, it would always help. Frequently deemed a defect. So if a student, for example, shows that they've got a misunderstanding of something, for example, that misunderstanding can be deemed as some form of a defective knowledge. It can be seen as a defect in this quality assurance process product. And as a result, it can lead to really two possible outcomes. One is labeling of students as smart or bright or not smart, but also categorization. Okay, so this is where we get sort of streaming of learners. This is where we get, for example, the idea of targeting a C grade or targeting a B grade for a particular learner, for example. And we get to a point in education where we actually believe that we can measure the learning potential of a human being, which is an extremely brave thing to say, regardless of our educational experience. And I want to make one more point about the current educational paradigm, and there are many others, of course there are, and that in our current education model, largely because of this quality assurance process, as the product moves down the production line, testing is snapshot. Okay, so testing is snapshot. And because it's snapshot, we also find that it's separate from the learning experience and separate from the learning experience. So we end up in a situation where, broadly speaking, again, always with exceptions, the idea of the test is separate from the idea of learning the material, of learning the skills, of learning the behavior. The data comes out of the snapshot test rather than the data diagnostically coming out of the ongoing learning cycle and the warmth of making errors and spotting diagnostically what is strong and what needs working on within the young person's experience of that skills, knowledge, and behaviors. So look, I think these are some really important points. And maybe if we're going to kind of pictorially, that's too hard to say this time of year, this time of the evening. If we're going to represent that pictorially, if this blue line over here, which I'm just going to sort of make vaguely pink, if this over here is mastery of a particular skill or a particular set of knowledge, see this blue box maybe as one topic area or even one lesson. If mastery is up here, of course, we're going to have our learners all from different start points. So all of our learners are going to experience different start points. And of course, what's going to happen is if we broadly do the same processes to those learners, broadly speaking, there'll always be exceptions, of course, they're broadly going to make roughly the same kind of progress. So those with the high start point might experience this knowledge of mastery or almost mastery. And those students who are starting from a much weaker base, for example, maybe some way off that mastery. And what I found happens a lot in education is that somehow the system and the teachers operating the system, what they'll do is they'll then bring this standard down, and gradually this standard will come down until there's like a lower standard being set for different kinds of learners. So this learner here might have been somehow, said before, labeled as a C grade learner. So therefore, we set the ceiling and the target for their learning at something which is much lower. And my argument is that this is actually as a result of the one pace fits all model, not of this person or this person or this person's intellectual capacity. That in fact, the fact that many students don't go on to master topics, don't go on to master skills, knowledge and behavior is really not a reflection of what's between the ears of that human being, but is actually a direct reflection of the educational model and system they've been exposed to. Now, of course, we have a situation where the skills, knowledge and behaviors of a child is not just dependent on what they experience in the classroom, it's dependent on the role modeling at home, the status of education, the access to literature, the feeling they have when they open that book and they get stuck, and how they deal with that issue of confidence. All those things are relevant. But we can only control what we can control. And for me, this one pace fits all, moving on regardless of mastery, is a problem. And I think it's a problem because of this. And I've put this analogy of a cheese in here. What happens, of course, with this model, if this is one topic here, this is just one topic. I mean, it could be a course, it could be a qualification, it could be the whole of maths, the whole of science, the whole of PE, whatever. But let's just say it's one topic. And let's say that it's this topic here. Well, of course, what we end up with is in that one topic, the student has a big hole. This student has a big hole of knowledge that they don't know, excuse me, or skills that they don't know. So, of course, when they come to build more knowledge, I do apologize, when they come to build more knowledge on top of that shaky Swiss cheese type foundation, that ultimately at some point going to struggle. And I tell you, we might not even see that struggling moment in that GCSE or in that A-level. They might get through it despite these weaknesses, but sooner or later they're going to get caught out. A couple of more points about current paradigm. I want to say that it's standardized to all broadly. There are exceptions, of course. So it's a standardized process. It's standardized. So, you know, students go through this kind of, you know, they go through these series of processes with knowledge that's being poured towards them. Hopefully it sticks. Some teachers manage to produce good quality differentiation, but the idea of what I just said over here, which is bringing the bar down for different students, in my opinion, isn't good differentiation. It's just a response to the educational model that's in place. The other point I want to make before we get on to talk about mastery in detail is that in this model, the classroom and the homework are the two main experiences. Okay, so things happen in the classroom, things happen at homework, but basically there is like a difference, a block between, let me get rid of that, there is a block between the two, and it's hard for the homework experience and the classroom experience to be kind of unified because they are ultimately different experiences with different resources available. And one of the points I'm going to make is, can we make the classroom available constantly from everywhere with every single resource? And lastly, we might say that teaching, generally speaking, if we think about like lecturing, broadcasting of teaching, teaching is a one-off deal, So that is to say that, you know, we teach our energy systems on a Tuesday morning, one day in September, and it happens there and then, and that's it. And if the student doesn't master that then and doesn't get the exposure they need, it's hard for them to return to that teaching. Perhaps what we'll need to be looking for is a model whereby every component of this wall of knowledge is absolutely rock solid, built on really rock solid foundations. For me, that is ultimately what the mastery model of learning is all about, and what we're going to talk about this evening, so that no matter what is built on top of it, that framework, that structure has the strength to survive it. All right, I'm going to do one more section before I come back into the room and sort of answer some chat questions, and that is the basic premise of mastery. So look, I've mouthed off there, I've criticized the current paradigm. What do I have to offer in replacement of that? Well, a couple of points that I think are essential with regard to mastery model of learning. And the first one is this: there is no arbitrary start and finish point to a learning experience except for mastery of knowledge, skills, and behaviors. So it really obliterates this idea that topic 1 goes in week 1, topic 2 goes in week 2, topic 3 goes in week 3. Because while that will work for some, it will fail to work for many. And that is something we have to address in education. Secondly, even when knowledge, skills, and behaviors are learned, the learner must be able to practice them for them to be returned. So this is also about returning. This is also about saying, you know what, I might have learned something, a core scientific process and understanding in year 7, but at some point I'm going to need to return to it, to refresh it, to retain it, to make sure it's live and active knowledge in my mind. And I think that very frequently that doesn't happen, or isn't enabled to happen. If a student really does have a deficit of something which is thought to be basic, they do have this deficit over here, how do they return to be able to solve that? How can they go back to be able to solve that particular deficit? And I think it's difficult in many, many cases. So one of the premises of mastery that I want people to take away from this is that learning in this model is always self-paced. Always self-paced. Now, I know that's going to bring some people out in a sweat, but trust me, it is not as scary as it sounds. We have a dominant mentality, I think, across education as a whole, which is that the teacher is a mechanism for being at the front and controlling the rhythm, the direction, the pace of learning. I don't think they need to. I think when students are enabled with the resources that they need to succeed, and when students believe in what they're doing, they will self-pace their learning, and they will take on huge amounts of responsibility for self-directing and self-pacing what they're doing. So this self-pacing, I think, is absolutely critical if we want to bring in a mastery model of learning. I say categorically, actually, that it's almost impossible to achieve a mastery model of learning if the dominant experience in the classroom is a one-pace-fits-all broadcast lecture. If that's the dominant experience, mastery is going to be very, very, very difficult to achieve. I can't say it's impossible. I just think it would be unbelievably challenging. I also want to say that the only target is mastery. And that is to say that no matter what some FFT grade shows or an ALICE or an ALPS grade shows, the only justifiable and ethical target, I believe, and I can only speak for myself, that I believe that teachers should be helping their students to aim for and try and achieve is mastery of knowledge, skills, and behaviors. Now, if we limit access to the resources that the students need to succeed to achieve that by teaching being one-off experience, by the classroom not being constantly available, by the teacher's time being taken up with mechanistic processes of planning, delivering, and marking, then this is very difficult to achieve. And maybe is the very reason why we don't have this as a dominant model at the moment. But that can be the only target. I'm not qualified to say that learning potential definitely cannot be measured. I'm not qualified to say that there's no such thing as intellectual ability, but I don't think it's the driver of success. I think the educational model is the driver of success, and I think that's what we need to try and bring about with conversations like this one. Thirdly, and I've mentioned this a little bit already, all resources, always accessible. So I want you to think about, maybe a piece of teaching you did today. Can the students access it tonight? Can the students get teaching as they need it, when they need it? And it's not just for the teaching, it's not just that. It can, of course, relate to resources, to tasks, to problem sets, to questions, to mark schemes, to past papers, to project work, to collaborative work, to group structures. All those resources, in my opinion, need to be always accessible to allow for individual pacing and progression within that model. And this, for me, goes very close to my educational heart, and I'll tell you this right now. And it's about errors. In the mastery model, errors are indicators. It's a bit like putting your left finger down on your indicator to say that you're going left. In the classroom, an error is an indicator that learning is about to happen. That learning is about to happen. I know my handwriting's bad tonight, by the way, but you'll have to live with me. And what I mean by this is that if we can change the educational paradigm to say that actually within our educational model, we're saying that if a student makes a mistake, we're not saying it's necessarily a good thing, but it actually gives us really cool information to be able to, for us to say diagnostically, now we know what we need to do. Now we know what the problem was. Now we've found the area that we can work and improve on. And for me, that is the premise of mastery. It's constantly trying to find little misunderstandings, little nuances. It's constantly trying to get that click of understanding that then helps the student to solve that blockage, solve that barrier. All right, I'm going to come briefly back into the webinar room. And I said before, you can have a look at how terribly unshaved I am. I do apologise. Here I am. And I know I've got a big beam of light coming down here as well. I did actually think about taking a light bulb out, but in the end I didn't. I didn't manage it. If people want to just comment on things in the chat and ask questions, feel free, and I'll do my very best to answer those. I'm really aware this evening that I'm probably being quite provocative. I don't know. I really feel strongly about these sort of things. You know, I really feel like one of the things that happened in my teaching was that throughout my teaching, it was sort of, it gradually improved and got better and better. But I always had this feeling that something wasn't right, that something could be significantly better, that something I had students who should have been achieving much better than they ended up achieving, and I was always surprised by a handful of results. I couldn't figure out why that had happened. And I couldn't figure out, despite the quality process we were trying to apply, why those things still happened. And I feel that mastery learning kind of helps to understand that, really, because there were gaps, there were holes. And those holes don't just lead to like a technical deficiency. They don't know this chunk of knowledge or whatever. It leads to a deficit of confidence. You know, man, we don't need to think about that too much. We know if we feel weak in something, it makes us kind of feel less inclined, less confident to build on that thing and to grow. So therefore, this constant building of 60% of this knowledge, 70% of this knowledge, then a bit more, then move on anyway. It builds, I think, of these lacks of these holes in confidence, not just in technical knowledge. Okay, from Declan, how do you manage resource in the classroom when you don't have a dedicated PE classroom? As you mentioned, resources need to be available. Really hard, yeah. I mean, two things on that. One, fight for it. I think, you know, like managing upwards is a very important process for heads of PE, that sort of role, to really battle for those kind of resources. If you're constantly moving in and out of classrooms, then I guess it's about having, you know, really potent mobile resources that you can go to. Now, I don't know if I'm thinking about a series of folders where there's past paper questions, worksheets, project work, etc., in different folders that somehow you manage to get out into the classroom. When I first read that, I thought about a trolley you could push around. You know, you have your theory trolley or something like that and I don't know how practical it is in your school, but it's about making it work and trying to achieve that, I suppose. I don't know if I have an exact answer to that, but those would be some of my kind of general points in reflection of that. By the way, in my last teaching job, I had exactly that situation. I found that really hard, Declan. I didn't have a dedicated teaching space, and I found that to be difficult. So I do recognise your point there. It's not an easy thing. Again, negotiating with whose classroom it is, or is it one of those really shared classrooms where anything and everything happens in there, then that can be problematic. But yeah, think about that mobile trolley, taking the folders with you, having those resources, but having them mobile, I suppose, would be one way to think about it. All right, I am wary of time, so we are going to move on. So what are the main advantages in this model? Let's have a quick look at this. Only a few points here for me to really draw out with you, so I'll try and get this moved nice and quickly so we're on good time. One of the things for me, and this relates back to my point about confidence, is that you end up with zero labeling. There's no idea of being the smart kid, the not smart kid, the kid that's an A grade student, a top set student, a class this, a class that. No, everyone is working towards mastery and they are finding their individual rhythm. I've even had occasions on one or two. I mean, this is becoming I'll just bear in mind, I just realised I haven't actually shared my screen with you. I bet you're all shouting at me there, weren't you? There we go. I hope you can see my screen okay now. So I've even had cases in the past where students have even celebrated mistakes that they've made. Now, I know that seems a little bit extreme in some ways, but this idea of labelling, I think, is really detrimental to young people. And they, of course, end up labelling themselves and within themselves, within their groups. I'm sure you'll have examples of that in your school itself. I want to mention the point I made to you a minute ago about confidence. Confidence really skyrockets in this model. And it skyrockets because I think of a very simple concept, and it's this one here that I'm going to put on right now with my incredibly shaky line. And that is to say that it's almost impossible to get completely stuck. Almost impossible to get completely stuck. Now, a lot of you know the work I do and know that I work, for example, my lessons are done by, I have them all recorded in video tutorials, sort of 10-minute, excuse me, tutorials. And therefore, those are the kinds of resources that the student can constantly refer to if they get a moment or experience of stuckness to unglue themselves from that situation. So it's much harder, therefore, in that particular scenario for a student to become stuck on a particular concept. I also want to say that I think another thing that happens in this kind of learning model is that the quality of discourse, the conversations between teachers and learners and between learners themselves goes up dramatically. And I want to just give one example of that. And it's the idea of the teacher having more time for one-to-one guidance with students or small group teaching of students. I think it's incredibly potent, not necessarily one-to-one, it might be 1 to 3, 1 to 4, but individual small group attention for students that need it most in the areas that they need it most. My last point on the main advantages, let me just squeeze it in down here, is that errors, as I said before, are positive. And I just want you to pause on that and think about that. I think it's very contrary to what our dominant experiences of classrooms are, that errors are a good thing, and they provide, if you like, a diagnostic environment. They provide a diagnostic environment. So just bear with me a second. So what I mean by that is that we can actually say that in the mastery model classroom, data centricity becomes far greater. So we have an increase in data centricity in the classroom, but it's really important. This data is not produced by the teacher, but for the teacher. Now, I've just picked 1, 2, 3 sets of data that I use through a structure called the Khan Academy, which I'm going to talk a little bit more later on. And I haven't done anything whatsoever to produce this particular data. Now, it's just snapshot data. But what it does allow you to do, if you have this sort of mechanism, is for it to say, right, that's specifically where our deficit is with this specific student. That's where the diagnostics are suggesting to us that we can actually intervene and make a significant difference to that student. And I think that's incredibly rich, and I think that's incredibly important. What I found in education a great deal over the last 10 years is that we produce data because we're told to produce data. We do a data producing test because we have to report on something, rather than thinking from the start point of saying, right, how can we provide an assessment structure that is built into the learning experience, provides ongoing, constant, live, volatile data, which we can act on constantly. And what we tend to do, of course, is then come back to that snapshot. Learn, 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 test. Learn, 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 test. Well, what about the learning producing the data such as this, and therefore intervening on this so that when you come to that snapshot test, not saying we take it out, but when we come to it, we've actually tried to iron out through the diagnostics what the deficits actually are. All right, I'm just going to change my canvas over here. So just bear with me a second. I'm not going to save what I've just done there. And I'm just going to find my mastery model 2 here. We've got a couple more points that we're going to go on to. All right, so main disadvantages. What is negative about this? Because let's not wax lyrical about this as if this is perfect, because it definitely isn't. So what is going to be a disadvantage, a drawback of trying to do this? Well, without question, one of the main thing is change, right? And the idea of new resources. How do I actually do that, James? I'm not saying I've got all the answers to that right now, but what I would like to do is say, right, let's give a big picture of this. The other thing I'd like to say about the new resources kind of challenge is I think we have to have like a systems approach to this. If we are in a situation where school A and teacher A has to produce all these resources for their school, and school B as well, and teacher B, and school C and teacher C, it's not going to work. But what we can do is work collaboratively, have central systems which produce and refine resources so that teachers can use those centralized resources and then make them individualized for their particular setting. So for me, the idea of a school doesn't end where the main building or the school hall or the school gate finishes. Surely the whole education system is the school, and therefore this systems approach can really make much more efficient the advantage, in this case the disadvantage, of having those resources available and constantly available to students. Other disadvantages for me is that if you do somehow manage to switch your mechanisms towards a mastery model, it's going to be different to other subjects. So your students are going to be experiencing one thing with you and probably something quite different, maybe more traditional in their other classrooms. That is going to be a challenge. That is something that, you're going to have to be aware of, and, the skills, the understanding, the confidence, and the expectations of the students are going to need to be developed there. I want to sort of put this one in here. A lot of people get concerned about course delivery. We won't have time to get through the course. People will fall behind. We will not. They will not get exposure to everything. Let's call that falling behind. Well, I guess that is a possibility. All of the learning coming out of places like Khan Academy, blended learning model shows the same thing really continuously. That is what you expect at the start. When you start a mastery model, you do have students that fly off into the distance and go really fast, because those are, in inverted commas, the smart kids, and do really well. And there's a group of students who do sort of linger on the basic concepts, gradually building a mastery. But time after time after time, that model shows again and again and again that those students who sort of hover around at the early stages, the early topics, really catch up very rapidly and often overtake those that are considered previously to be the smart kids, because they've built up that skill set, they've built up that confidence, which is so important. And the other thing that might be maybe a disadvantage is that this model might be a threat. It might be a threat to establishment. It might be a threat to those that really want the status quo to be maintained. So I want to say here right now, we should not be waiting for the policymakers to try and drive a system like this through. It is not going to happen because it doesn't serve their interest. If this system can genuinely be socially enabling for a much broader range of people from all sorts of social stratification, then this model has to be driven by people. It will not come from policymakers. It will not come from above. And I think that's a really important point to make. So we can't wait. If we believe in this, we can't wait for this to come from above, because it isn't going to happen. A couple of points before I get on to, or before I come back into the webinar room. I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit here. I want to talk a little bit about complexity. I've been reading a lot about complexity theory recently. And it's basically the issue that even if you think you've spotted something, it's the idea that everything is a complex issue. All right, so I just want to give you an example of that. You might feel you don't have time for your marking, for example. That's not a lack of time because there's not enough time for marking. That's going to be a combination of factors. That's going to be, for example, that you spend so much, well, not in all cases, but in some cases, that people spend so much time planning for delivery and delivering in lessons themselves, that student ownership is secondary to teacher ownership, that teachers have not got brilliant systems in place, no fault of their own, because those systems are not available, that don't enable automated marking of rote learning type activities. And that is something that can be improved on. So my point is that I don't have time for marking, or I've got this challenge, or I've got that challenge. It's going to be a combination of complex factors that are causing that. And I also want to talk about the difference between a symptom and a cause. And that is to say that we'll often treat the symptom of something that seems to be wrong. The students aren't learning deeply and retaining knowledge, and therefore the students are bad, when often the cause of that is somehow a more underpinning issue relating to the educational model and that sort of Swiss cheese model of deficit that the students have built up in the past. So that we need to spot the differences between a symptom of the problem and a cause of the problem. And finally, because of complexity theory, and I think this is something I encourage anyone to read about more broadly, I come to the conclusion that you have to question everything. What I mean by that is that I think there's so many assumptions in education, and especially in institutionalized education, that we just never get to question. I think we have to start that process. I think many of you will be doing it already, I'm sure, but we have to question quite literally everything that goes on around us. If it seems normal, traditional state, we have to question that, and we have to bring out potentially brilliant questions that challenge the assumptions that drive a lot of these practices onwards. All right, I'm going to come back into the webinar room and see how things are going. So yeah, Charlotte, with smaller group teaching, would you focus on the mastery of the knowledge or the mastery of how to answer the exam questions 48, 60, and so on? For a C, it's proven difficult to achieve the majority. Look, I don't see them as separate for me, Charlotte. I mean, obviously, I can't give you the answer to every single challenge, but for me, the idea of mastering knowledge and the idea of then having the skill to write an extended writer, they're not separate concerns for me, there can be a lot of knowledge development that comes out through the practice of writing process. Equally, there can be a lot of equipping to do the writing by making sure that knowledge is known razor sharp in preparation for that process. The other thing I find a lot with extended writing is that the first few experiences of it need to be much more collaborative in their experience for the students, so that, again, getting stuck and having only the ideas that the student has access to, or the student has between their ears, as the only resource that they've got to fall back on. I think those need to be more collaborative. Lee, does this model not lend itself to a take the exam when you are ready? Yes, it does. I thought long and hard about talking to you about that tonight, and I decided not to, just simply because I haven't read the rest of it, because this is phased out by current government costs to take the exam at the end of the year. Look, I just don't think it's a reality for me to say to you now that in a really genuinely educational model, a genuine model that serves the way human beings actually learn, that the assessment should be taken at the time that the student chooses it, or the student and the people that are around the student choose for it to be, not at some arbitrary date in the summer. I did think about talking to you about that tonight, but it just felt like a battle that can't be won at this particular moment, so I just stepped back away from it. But you're absolutely right, you know. Why is that? Who are these people to decide that a student has to have this level of knowledge on this date in their life at this particular moment? You know, if we started, would we make it like that? If we were starting out afresh now, with the quality of technology we've got available today, with the access to immediate communication, I'm not sure we would. So for me, it's a big question, but it's one that I don't feel we're ready to tackle right now. But it's something I think about a great deal, and for me, the conversation needs to switch to those sorts of things. And again, I don't believe for a second that sort of shift will come from the policymaker level, because I think that while we see very many problems in the educational structures as they are now, and the dominant educational model as it is right now, I don't think the policymakers have any problem with that. I think it's perfect for the policymakers, because it keeps the status quo, or it keeps a distraction onto things that ultimately, you know, allow a distraction from maybe like a reality and a real check of reality. So so that change will never come from above. It might come if we pressure it enough and we create enough of a movement, then it might come from that. Anyway, I don't want to get too political, but it's a good question, Liam. I'm actually glad that you asked that. Okay, a couple of things before excuse me, a couple of additional things before we get towards a finishing point this evening. I want to talk to you about some current models that maybe are possibilities of working this way. The first one is a really lovely, simple one, and many of you out there will have taught a child to ride a bike, for example. I want you to think about that experience, and I want you to think about how that experience actually works for a child. You know, that this child, this one in particular, appears to be with his dad. You know, this child is going to have that support, the stabilizers, and then the one stabilizer, and the seat being held, and the gradually letting go, and they're running alongside, and there's a bit of a wobble and catch them as they fall. All of that is going to be happening at exactly the time when the child needs it, at exactly the right level of skill. Imagine this child was going to kind of wobbly now sort of cycle along, moving on at this point and saying, right, that's enough, we're moving on to the next challenge or the next lesson or the next topic. It would be akin to saying to this child, okay, you're 60% cyclist, or you're 60% two-wheel cyclist now it's time for a unicycle. Now, we know we wouldn't do that in that scenario, so why do we do it in education? And we've got to allow students to gain the confidence and the potency and the foundation level skills before we really move them on to the much more technically challenging skill. The other real big platform I would encourage you to have a look at, and it's one that's absolutely inspired me in all of my work, is that of the Khan Academy and of Salman Khan. And one of the next steps I'm going to say here is watch or read Sal Khan. And I can't emphasize that enough, because he's someone that's absolutely inspired me in the work that I do every single day. The Khan Academy is the world's biggest school. It's an online learning platform. It's built around video tutorials, online tasks and marking, and a huge amount of data diagnostics. And it's used widely by many, many, many North American schools. And it was started particularly in the Los Altos district of in California, where the whole district rolled out Khan Academy as its core maths program for a handful of classes in a handful of schools, and it really had fantastically positive results. The results themselves in maths performance went up, but what went up particularly was the level of competency in wider maths and the level of confidence that the students experienced and the students' actual ongoing experience of learning something like mathematics. And I would really encourage you to spend as much time going onto this free website, khanacademy.org, and try and understand that movement, because once you understand that, you will see very clearly some of the challenges that are posed within our current educational model. And I also obviously want to highlight the work that I do. If you happen to be a PE teacher and you're in the room, many of you will know about this already. I've got a platform called mypeexam.org, excuse me. And the idea here is that students have constant access to video tutorials of lessons. And it's, a bit like we're doing now, black screen, the concepts have been explained to the students, and they also have access to questions and automated marking. And they have access to this constantly, questions and marking. They have access to this absolutely constantly. So whenever they need it, when it's suggested to them, or indeed when they choose it themselves, they use this platform to do core learning experiences. Now, I want to say that in no way am I saying that something like screen time, computer time is the answer to all of our educational problems. In fact, I don't think it is. My personal view about technology and education, I'm not remotely interested in technology in education, but I am interested in what technology can do to education, that it can change the channel, it can change the paradigm, it can get resources to where they're needed. And I think that's ultimately what technology is for in education. It's to actually humanize the classroom, okay, to change the classroom from a one-pace-fits-all classroom to an individually paced, self-paced learning experience for individual human beings. So for me, technology and education is about the humanization process. I also want to say just one thing about screen time. One of the rules that that might be worth sort of thinking about is that no more, so a maximum of a quarter of time on screen. Okay, so 3/4 of a student's time should be spent doing active processes, project work, group work, questioning, writing, reading, listening, those sorts of processes. So if we're looking at some kind of technological aspect to this mastery model, then we really need to be thinking about that screen time as a maximum of kind of 1/4. Next steps to finish off with here. I've already said there, watch, read, Salcom. There's loads of other researchers and we'll come back to them at another point. I really want you guys to talk about this, to talk and challenge, to take this session away. And I realize it hasn't been perfect. There's already things I wish I'd said differently and done differently, but, to talk about it, to recognize that someone's saying it doesn't have to be that way and it can change, it can be different. And to talk about that and to challenge ideas and dominant assumptions that you see around you. They may not be in your department, they may not be in your classroom, but they'll be around you somewhere. I said earlier about questioning everything. I can't emphasize this enough. There are so many assumptions in education that almost never get challenged, and I think we have to get into a mindset where we question absolutely everything. One last sort of philosophical point before I get to a more pragmatic point is that I would really encourage colleagues to reject, and I did it completely all in one go. Other people might take a bit longer to do this and feel it before they do it, but reject the process of a broadcast lecture. The idea that a classroom is based around a teacher being at the front, PowerPointing, describing, whiteboarding from the front as the dominant learning experience. I really think we need to reject that, because I think it's one of the biggest tyrannies, one of the biggest barriers that gets in the way of truly owned self-paced learning for students. Now, I love being at the front of a classroom, so it hurts me even to say it, but this is a really, as an impact learning experience, being lectured to, being taught from the front, very frequently doesn't achieve really deep intuitive learning. Only doing, making mistakes, building, constructing, breaking, debating, these are the things that bring out deeper, more intuitive learning. So we need to give them more emphasis and more time in the lesson. Finally, and I think this is really a pragmatic point to finish on, take one topic and use the use of mastery model for one topic. Choose one topic that you are not gonna let go until you have got firm data that all of your students have mastered it, and keep going back, don't move on. I'm not saying that nobody can move on, but have an opportunity that students can constantly come back to that topic when they need to in order to prove their mastery of knowledge, skills, and behaviors within that particular topic area. You will learn a lot from that. I'm sure you've probably done this already, but you'll learn a lot from that because it actually provides a lot of insight and it challenges a lot of kind of the fears of what might go wrong. And by the way, some things will go wrong. You know, when we change something which has been very significant in our jobs, it doesn't go perfectly for the first time. That's completely normal. But using the mastery model, challenging one topic, I think is a way to start. All right, I'm just going to come back into the webinar room briefly here. Just bear with me a second. Okay, so if people obviously want to post a couple of chat comments, feel free to do that into the chat there. I hope that's been useful to people this evening. You know, I sort of feel like it's I don't know. I'm kind of reflecting on. I'm not too sure really about how tonight's gone, but you know, I hope what you can see from this is that, from my perspective, it's something that really needs to be asked, and people need to start asking questions about this particular topic area, because I just don't think this conversation's happening. I've been hearing a lot about Pixel, and there'll be people in here who'll work with Pixel, who will have associations with the Pixel group, and a lot of their quality assurance process will come through that sort of Pixel structure. If you don't know what Pixel is, don't worry. It's just almost like it's a group of schools that collaborate together to share and pool really top quality resources, and they pay a lot of money to be able to do that. And I've heard a lot that Pixel advocates very significantly the idea of mastery, but I have to say about Pixel, even though it's a good organization doing a good job with a lot of schools, I have to say that their dominant setting has really got nothing to do with mastery at all. It's got to do with that snapshot assessment, judging students, identifying defects, and weeding out defects in that way. So I do think there's a conflict of interest there, because you've got on one hand the ideas of mastery being embraced, that this is how you get deep intuitive learning, but then you've also got the processes that sit behind that, in my opinion at least, are much more traditional and perhaps don't honour the systems that should bring about a mastery experience. The other thing I was going to say about mastery, I almost get embarrassed by using the term mastery model of learning, because I don't think it's got a name. It's just how human beings learn, you know, and we've got experiences ourselves of that, and that is to say that you know, we often need to repeat things on a number of occasions. We often need to go forward and back, apply it, change it, get it wrong, and then we might master something. The fact that that isn't frequently enough the dominant experience in schools really needs challenging, in my opinion. I don't think it's about having especially named mastery models. It's just about recognizing how human beings learn, and about trying to align our educational systems and structures towards that human setting. Lee, thank you to you, and thank you for your kind message in there. I really appreciate that. The only thing I want to do before I finish, and I hope people don't mind me doing this, I'm just gonna put a button up onto the screen, which allows you to, if you do find this sort of thing interesting, and you were sort of thinking that, okay, there's something to follow up on here. If there's some relevance of speaking to me, having me in person, get me into school, etc., do feel free to get in touch in that way. So that's just a link to an inquiry form, and it might be nice for you to hit that link there and just make some inquiries about the possibility of in-person training. I'd be very proud to come do that on a number of different topics. So many of you have been with me for many inset sessions or webinar sessions over the course of this term. Okay, so look, it kind of only really leaves me to say, look, a very Merry Christmas to everybody. Thank you so much for the support from so many of you all of this term. It genuinely appreciate. I've got to say, I'll be honest with you, I was proper shattered for this tonight. I'm so tired, and it felt like a real tonight felt like a really big strain, you know, to get this done tonight. So I'm a bit worried I haven't been sort of my usual self. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I hope you realise I do really try hard to do these. And this one, I have to say this one, I was so tired this afternoon. I thought, oh my goodness me, I don't know if I can do it. But anyway, we've done a session. I think we started a conversation here, and hopefully that session can lead to some really good questions. I would be really proud to have conversations with you in the future. My email is james@mypeexam.org, james@mypeexam.org. From Andrew, great session, lots to think about. Would love to see an example of this model in action in your class. Are there any clips available? Excuse me. I don't have any clips specifically of classrooms. I mean, what might be interesting there, Andrew, is for us to actually talk about what the classroom would actually look like. I've actually been commissioning a video in relation to this at the moment, and script is actually written and done, and we're just going into like the editing and animation stage of that to answer this particular question. But I think, you know, what we could do is have a conversation about it in person and see if I can, you know, broaden out some ideas there, because I do think that's the thing, right? You have lots of I did a session a couple of weeks ago where it was literally on the ground, this activity, this activity, this activity. I feel like this one's more conceptual, right? It's like, okay, well, that stuff might not be optimal, therefore there are these ideas, and then how do I put them in place on the ground? And I do agree with you, it might not be the thing you can just grab and just do straight away, but I think understanding it conceptually first is very important. But I'd be really welcoming of a conversation, Andrew. Charlotte, thank you, all the best for 2016. You too. 2016 is a big number, isn't it? You know, yeah, 2016 is a lot. Andrew, that would be great. I think, yeah, let's do that, Andrew. So James at MyP, let me just type it into the chat just in case you didn't note it down earlier. So yeah, just put my email into the chat there, so feel free to drop me a note on that, Andrew, and we'll have a good chat. Okay. And yeah, I said before, fantastic new year. Have a great break when it finally comes around to it. I'm away in Spain for 10 days working all the way through, but still a bit of a change of scene. My partner Martha, she's a Barcelona girl, and we're going to go over there for 10 days, stay with family and have a proper change of scenery, and have some peace and quiet and do all that sort of stuff. And it's going to be good. So I wish you all a really happy Christmas. I hope Santa brings you all of your dreams, and all the best for the new year. Look after yourselves. Take care.